It's a very moving picture. Just in the last few minutes, we've had this US resolution in the UN vetoed by China and Russia. I mean, frankly, there's nothing in the text of that should have been a problem for them. It's the furthest the Americans ever gone in calling for a immediate and sustained ceasefire. I guess the answer is that there is no resolution that the US could have put forward that the Russians and the Chinese would have supported. This is essentially a political act to say we are not lining up with the Americans on anything at the moment. It's a huge missed opportunity because it would have focused world attention on the problem, and it contained a great deal of material which was very critical of Israel and Israel's failure to facilitate the humanitarian aid, as you were saying. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, Britain supports Israel's right to defend itself, but the humanitarian crisis and catastrophe going on in Gaza is essentially because aid isn't getting in, and it is Israel that has an iron grip on all the points of access to Gaza. So the letter that David Cameron wrote to Alicia Kearns, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee you referred to, is frankly angry, and he says he's intensely frustrated that these blockages, the 3-week delay in getting UK aid in, could be lifted by Israel as an act of policy.
You know, I have to hope that the Foreign Secretary is telling the truth and has his facts on the ground, you know, as much as one can. But we can't leave Hamas out of this picture, can we, either? There are different types of organisations, clearly. On paper, at least, there are different types of organisations. But if we were to withdraw support for Israel in this way, through armaments, isn't that essentially saying on you go Hamas?
No, I mean I think honestly you're exaggerating the scale.
I don't mean to. I'm kind of testing.
Yeah, no, I mean exaggerating the importance of that particular issue. Right. I mean, because I don't think the UK is a major arms supplier of Israel. We sent a small amount of arms to Israel over the years. It's America which is the absolutely key supplier of advanced weapons to Israel. And as Alicia Kearns was saying in the clip you played, if the UK concludes that Israel is breaching its international humanitarian law obligations, then under the criteria for issuing arms export licenses, the UK would not be sending any more arms to Israel. But frankly, that wouldn't make any material difference to the Israeli armed forces, certainly not in the short term. It would be a symbolic act, of course. It would have its political value, but it is not the same as supporting Israel's right to defend itself, and also, as you say, the absolute importance of getting the hostages back, not forgetting the horrors of what happened on the 7th of October, and Israel's right to do, all within its international law obligations to get those hostages back. So, I mean, I think stopping UK arms exports would be a powerful symbol. It honestly wouldn't affect the course of the military action in Gaza.
And in your view, politically, it wouldn't amount to the same as withdrawing our support for Israel's right to defend itself?
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, it would be one more point of pressure on Israel. The thing that really would start to change Israeli calculations, I think, is if the Americans said that they were cutting off their arms supplies because they're the ones that are supplying the advanced missiles and weapons that Israel is using every day in Gaza.
And that's hard to imagine that they would make that choice because it would enable Hamas and its friends.
That's right. That would be, of course, incredibly politically controversial in the US. President Biden is sounding more and more exasperated with Israel, it has to be said. Antony Blinken has been working so hard to try and get this deal where you get hostages out and a humanitarian pause or a ceasefire. Israel keeps rejecting the terms that are on offer. He might possibly restrict the use of some American weapons, I suppose, but I agree. I don't think they're going to cut off the whole supply of Israel. And there are many ways in which the UK has to keep up a dialogue with Israel and has to recognize that Israelis suffered terribly on the 7th of October, and that mustn't be forgotten in this conversation.
And indeed, the families of the hostages and the hostages themselves currently are alongside the civilians of Gaza as well. They are still suffering, aren't they? Not just on October the 7th.
Yes.
Can I ask you about what America might do next? Because I read a piece in this morning's Guardian suggesting that there was already a sort of alternative draft resolution if this one didn't go forward, which delinked, sort of uncoupled the freeing of the hostages with the urgent ceasefire, simply because between those 2 points you have this desperate humanitarian crisis and famine brewing, well, already impacting on people, but certainly a larger one brewing. That feels to me like it might be the most sensitive moment of all for America to uncouple those two things, hostages and a ceasefire.
Yes, except that on the ground, in the real world, as it
The
were, they
talking
have to go
continues.
together
Yeah.
because you won't get hostages out without a pause or a ceasefire in the fighting.
Mm.
And so that's why the two are basically combined. And you probably won't get the full flow of humanitarian aid in until there's a ceasefire, until Israel can be sure that Hamas aren't getting things in packaged up as aid. I mean, I suspect if the Russians and Chinese couldn't accept this resolution on the table today, which went a long way in the direction of the Palestinian and moderate Arab position, I don't think there's any resolution that can pass the Security Council in present circumstances. So I think the Americans will go back to the track of the grinding negotiation with the Qataris and the Egyptians and on the other side, the Israelis, to try and hammer out some basis for getting this fighting stopped, getting humanitarian aid in, and getting hostages home. That, at the end of the day, is the only practical thing to be doing in the short term, I think.
And of course, I mean, you'll know better than me whether this is true. It seems to me that you have the UN here, putting the UN in a particular place. You have the UN here doing its thing, failing to reach agreements on resolutions, and on the ground, in Qatar, in Egypt, in Doha, you have those ongoing talks, probably all the time, or certainly most of the time, reaching certain levels at different points. But those talks ongoing to free the hostages and to free some Palestinian prisoners as well. The two don't have to happen at the same time, do they?
No, and honestly, I don't think Israel is going to take any notice of UN resolutions passed in New York, however much support they have, because Israel is completely focused on what it's trying to do in Gaza. And it's that practical negotiation over the nitty-gritty of stopping the fighting, if only briefly, and getting hostages out. That's where a breakthrough might come. I have to say that Mr. Netanyahu is still absolutely stuck on this idea of destroying Hamas. I mean, I think we've seen after 4 months of this that, having thought that he cleared Hamas out of the north of Gaza, now the Israelis find that they're back in the Al Shifa hospital. Israel is having to go back into northern Gaza. Honestly, it is impossible to completely destroy Hamas. And if that's the goal, I don't see how this war ever ends. It's going to have to take some sort of settlement and clearly a post-conflict arrangement where Hamas does not have its hands on the levers of power. But people with Hamas affiliations, Hamas sympathies, will still be in Gaza because it's a political organization as much as it's a terrorist organization. So the Israeli side, whether it's Mr. Netanyahu or future prime minister, are going to have to accept one day they will have to find some sort of a post-conflict ceasefire with some Hamas supporters still there. And the idea of destroying Hamas completely is a recipe for prolonging this, forever.
Which may suit both Hamas and Netanyahu. You never know.
Yes, I mean, I think we need a new Israeli leadership, and I think we need a new Palestinian leadership, certainly, who can look beyond this terrible catastrophe that happened from the 7th of October and try and find a new way of living together, which has to, of course, offer peaceful and secure existence for Israel and, in due course, a Palestinian state. That was one of the things in this resolution that the Russians and Chinese have just vetoed, was a clarion call for a two-state solution. So, as I say, I don't think there's anything in the substance of this that they couldn't have accepted.